Welcome to Midnight Mysteries. If you feel like listening to a horror story, you're in the right place. Let me know what you think in the comments. Enjoy listening. It was shortly past midnight on July 17th, 1982, when Alex Voss pushed open the heavy sandblasted glass door of the building housing WKRZ radio station, the only source of life on an otherwise sleeping street in the tranquility of suburban London. The structure itself was an anachronism, a red brick building dating back to the 40s, with its arch windows now rendered opaque by time, and a large antenna standing like a steel tree against the night sky. Inside, the broadcasting studio was a cavern of sounds and memories, lined with sound-absorbing panels that had soaked up years of news, music, and the voices of countless DJs before Alex. Old posters of bands and movies, yellowed by time, adorned the walls, and an old desk lamp cast a warm but insufficient light, barely keeping the darkness at bay in the corners of the room. At the center of this refuge was the DJ console, surrounded by stacks of vinyl waiting to be revived by the turntable needle. Everything was immersed in a muffled silence, interrupted only by the constant ticking of the wall clock and the faint rustle of the air conditioning. The atmosphere was lonely, almost sacred, as if the studio were a church for the night faithful, with Alex its solitary priest, ready to celebrate a nocturnal ritual of music and words. Yet, there was something in the air that evening, an imperceptible electricity that made the hairs on the back of Alex's neck stand up in a thin, primal warning. It was an unconscious feeling he carried under his skin and could not shake off, a whisper in his mind that something that night would be different. As Alex Voss made his way through the shadows of the studio, the reverberation of his steps on the wooden floor marked the beginning of his nocturnal solitude. With an average build and hair now streaked with gray, Alex did not have the look of the classic radio DJ whose faces adorned the walls of more commercial stations. His was a face marked by sleepless nights and deep reflections, eyes that had seen too much to remain ignorant, but still curious enough to seek out the stories hidden in the folds of the dark. Radio was his escape, his personal corner away from the incessant noise of the day. Alex's motivations were simple: to seek connection in a world that increasingly chose isolation, to gather the hidden emotions behind each music request, and perhaps, in a way he had never confessed aloud, to keep his own loneliness company. Now seated in front of the still-off microphone, Alex felt the weight of a responsibility that no one had ever formally entrusted to him: to be the common thread for lost and night owl souls seeking comfort in his voice and the songs he chose. His initial feelings that night were no different from usual, a mix of anticipation and that subtle thrill that precedes the uncertainty of each new broadcast. Yet, that evening, beneath his classic routine, he continued to feel an imperceptible current of anxiety seeping into his soul. It was as if the solitude and silence surrounding him needed him to shake the foundations of his night. With a sigh, he turned on the microphone, ready to immerse himself in the tranquility of the broadcast. As the red-on-air light came on, Alex began his transmission with the calm and reassuring voice his listeners had come to know and expect. "Good evening, night lovers," he began. "This is Alex Voss, your voice in the storm. ready to guide you through the next hours with music that I hope will touch you deeply. His words were a sort of ritual he had performed thousands of times, always managing to maintain a spontaneous freshness. After introducing the first track, Alex leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the music fill the studio and the air around him. It was then that it happened. A light rustle, almost smothered by the music, slipped into his headphones. Alex opened his eyes suddenly, thinking it was a technical problem, but all the levels on the mixer seemed normal. He stood up to check the cables, and another sound caught his attention. A kind of whisper that seemed to come from the turntable itself. He leaned towards the device, with one hand still on the mixer, and listened more closely. The whisper became clearer, as if someone were speaking simultaneously with the singer on the vinyl. The voice distorted, but unmistakably repeating a series of numbers. 4, 7, 3. The time, he thought, was playing tricks on him, and for a moment he convinced himself he had imagined it all. After all, hours of music on headphones could play tricks. He decided to ignore it, thinking it might be an external transmitter interfering with his signal, or perhaps an imperfection in the vinyl highlighted by the more modern equipment he was using. He shook his head, trying to dispel the unease that had begun to creep inside him, and sat back down, determined to continue the broadcast as if nothing had happened. But once seated, the feeling of something unusual, something he could not explain, clung to his skin like nighttime humidity. The music track was nearing its end when Alex, still bewildered by the mysterious whisper, decided to play another vinyl. As the needle slid into the initial groove, Alex's voice intertwined with the intro of the new song. This one is for those who listen beyond the words, for those who seek hidden secrets in the pauses between beats. It was a phrase he had said many times before, yet that night, as he said it, he felt uneasy. With ears tuned, he waited for the potential repeat of the disturbance. As the music began to flow, another series of hissing sounds emerged from the background noise. This time, there was no doubt. Beneath the melody, the distorted voice repeated a disturbing phrase, a message. "Find me under the light before it fades," was what he could make out through the crackling. Alex felt his heartbeat sync with the nervous rhythm pounding in his temples. It was as if the darkness of the studio condensed, becoming heavier. He grabbed the volume knob, turning it down, and the ensuing silence was loaded, vibrating with mute questions. It couldn't be a technical problem or a signal overlap. That voice had something undeniably intentional. Alex's mind raced, seeking rational explanations, but the possibilities crumbled like sand through his fingers. How was it possible? Who could be sending that message? He couldn't take his eyes off the turntable, as if the answer could materialize at any moment in the polished wood and the vinyl spirals. He tried to compose himself, pressing the button that would bring him back on air. His voice, which had always been firm and confident, betrayed a slight tremor. "Sometimes," he said, trying to mask his disquiet behind a forced laugh, "even radio ghosts want to be heard." But in saying it, he knew he wasn't talking about simple electronic disturbances. There was something real, tangible, using the radio waves as a communication tool. The broadcast continued, But Alex's concentration was shattered like glass under the pressure of those encrypted messages. Every song he selected now was a vehicle for a new fragment of hidden truth. He promised himself that the next track would be just music, that he would ignore any whisper coming from the vinyl's grooves. But it was like a magnet drawing him in, and he couldn't help but listen and try to understand. The messages didn't keep him waiting. Between the bass and the guitar chords, other words snuck in. The key in the sound. Listen. It almost seemed like instructions were being given. But for what? Every song became a puzzle, every note a code to decipher. At that moment, Alex took a notebook, beginning to transcribe the fragments of phrases and numbers he could distinguish. As he did so, goosebumps rose on his arms. There was a logical thread in that madness, thin and almost imperceptible, but it seemed like a sequence to follow. The music that had always been his faithful companion was now becoming an enigma that made his head burn. He, who had always believed he guided the radio waves, now found himself navigating them like a castaway searching for land. Each track he played for the listeners added a clue, but with each new message, he felt his fear growing. It was an instinctive reaction. Ancient stories heard as a child returned to his mind. Stories of signals from hidden worlds, of messages in bottles crossing oceans of ether to reach unexpected recipients. So, he continued to play the music and talk to his listeners, trying to hide his feelings, while beneath the tranquil surface of the night DJ, the dark waters of a deep mystery began to swirl. The ticking of the wall clock, usually lost in the studio's background, became more insistent, marking the time Alex spent attentively listening to each hidden message. His initial doubts about the authenticity of such communications vanished. There were no logical explanations linked to technical issues. There was an intelligence behind those words, a clear intent. As another classic rock song filled the air, Alex sat up straight, letting the soft lighting of the studio be his companion. "All right," he whispered to himself, "let's admit it. Someone is trying to scare me." It was like a silent pact between him and the night, between him and the ether from which those messages came. The music became a backdrop to his thoughts, as every part of him accepted the reality of the situation. However, the tension continued to grow because he realized he wasn't just a spectator. He had become a participant, a chosen receiver for these enigmatic suggestions. And the fact that he couldn't fully understand their meaning filled him with a growing anxiety, making his heart beat uncontrollably. There was a loneliness in this acceptance, a loneliness exacerbated by the silence of others, by that mass of nocturnal listeners unaware of the dark correspondence he was receiving. Instinctively taking a deep breath, he decided to take a step toward the unknown. "I'm here," Alex said, almost expecting an immediate response from the shadowy voice. "I'm listening. Speak." And like in the worst nightmares, the messages became more frequent, bolder. Alex found himself immersed in a one-way flow where every song became a piece of a larger puzzle, a story unfolding message after message. Every vinyl he put on became a potential source of hidden truth. He spent the moments between songs scrutinizing the words he had jotted down, looking for connections and patterns, building a mental map of this mystery he couldn't understand but increasingly feared. An idea came to him. He began playing the tracks at different speeds, listening backward, trying to capture every variation that might be a missing piece. With his gaze always fixed on the turntable, his hand feverishly wrote down every new discovery, every new phrase that emerged from the sound distortion. I hide the truth within the guilt. A shiver ran down his spine as he transcribed. What kind of truth was hidden in guilt? With each new song, with each passing hour, Alex felt he was getting closer and closer to a turning point. The words began to form a narrative, albeit incomplete. Words like witness, deception, repentance emerged with spectral clarity from the vinyl. The songs, once familiar and reassuring, had now become vehicles of a dark story begging to be understood. The loneliness of the radio studio was like a resonating chamber for his thoughts, and he bounced between the anxiety of unraveling the enigma and the fear of what he might discover. The night was wearing on, but Alex still had no solution to that tangle of phrases and numbers. He moved from the turntable to the computer, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he searched for any possible historical reference related to the radio station. The encrypted messages now overlapped in his mind with fragments of history he had always taken for granted. Old urban legends, tales of former employees, stories of misfortune and forgotten tragedies. Find me under the light. That particular message resonated insistently. The light. Could it refer to the old neon sign of the station, broken and never repaired, still hanging outside the window of the building? He looked out the window, but the bad weather prevented him from seeing anything except perhaps a shadow moving quickly away. Maybe he was going crazy, starting to see things that didn't exist. He felt his sanity rapidly slipping away. Too many messages, too many numbers, too complicated. His research led him to an archive article. A tragic accident many years ago, right at that radio station. A beloved DJ suddenly disappeared without a trace on a night like this, with a storm raging outside. No body was ever found, no explanation given, only a series of interrupted broadcasts and the echo of music that abruptly stopped. Exhausted, Alex tried to piece together the clues, his mind forcing combinations to find something plausible. And then, all at once, Alex realized that every message seemed to be a fragment of that night lost in time. I hide the truth within the guilt. Were these perhaps the words of the missing DJ, a confession or a cry for help engraved in the vinyl? The tension in Alex's chest intensified as he tried to match the dates of the songs with the era of the incident. The music, which had once been a comfort on sleepless nights, now seemed like a bridge to the past, a tool carrying the voice of a lost soul across time and space. Alex felt the weight of that discovery, as if he had just uncovered a secret passage to a truth many had forgotten or deliberately chosen to ignore. The night inexorably moved towards dawn, but the darkness inside the studio now seemed deeper, almost tangible. The atmosphere in the studio had grown tense. The shadows seemed to move to the rhythm of an invisible melody. The ticking of the clock in the background intertwined with the scratchy sound of the spinning vinyl, each tick a heartbeat in the thickening darkness. The songs, once friends and confidants of long nights of solitude, now seemed to transform into sinister omens, bringing with them a sense of urgency and danger. One song in particular caught Alex's attention, a slow, almost funereal melody he had never heard before and was convinced he hadn't chosen. Despite his vast collection and knowledge of music, that track seemed to come from nowhere, an intruder among the other vinyls. The singer's voice was muffled, laden with an emotion that seeped through the distortingly familiar words. "The truth lies where innocence dies," the chorus recited, a phrase that matched no online database or Alex's memories. As the song ended, an icy chill crept into the studio, chilling Alex to the bone. Every new note that echoed in the studio seemed loaded with dark meanings. Every drumbeat echoed like a stealthy step behind him. Alex felt as if the music itself were watching him, judging his ability to uncover the secrets it held. He began to wonder if there was someone else in the station with him, someone pushing him to discover the truth, or perhaps someone who wanted the exact opposite. It seemed to him he could hear whispers just below the audible threshold, words that couldn't be impressed on any vinyl. His gaze kept darting to the closed studio doors, expecting each time to see them open or to spot a figure in the dark corner of the room. Fear mingled with determination as Alex continued to broadcast. He couldn't stop now that he was so close. Yet, with each new message deciphered, the sensation that he was about to touch something dangerously real grew within him. It was as if he were approaching a flame, drawn by the heat but terrified of the impending burn. The uniqueness of the evening moment, in which Alex Voss usually found comfort in solitude, had now turned into a frightening isolation, a trap where every air vibration seemed charged with threat. The outside world had slipped away, leaving him in a void filled only by radio waves, a cry in the ether that no one seemed to hear. The usual studio noises, the transmitter's hum, the whisper of the air conditioning, now seemed to suffocate under an incredible weight. Alex felt the pressure of invisible gazes. The walls themselves seemed to close in on him, mute witnesses pinning him in place. Every attempt to reach someone outside, a casual listener, a friend, even the police, failed miserably, leaving him even more isolated with his growing awareness of danger. With each song that ended, Alex strove to entertain his listeners with his calm and reassuring voice, but fear vibrated beneath every word. The intimacy of the broadcasting studio, once his refuge, now made him feel exposed, vulnerable. The windows were black eyes fixed on him, and every movement outside was a potential predator moving in the darkness. The realization that he was not alone in this game slowly settled into his mind. The messages through the songs suggested a presence watching him, perhaps having orchestrated every moment from the beginning. "I'm here with you," a whisper seemed to dance through the background noise of the frequency, a breath of words that couldn't have been sent via text message or written on a piece of paper. Loneliness weighed on Alex like a stone. Every whisper of the night, every creak of the old wood, every rustle that could be attributed to the wind, turned into proof of the presence of something or someone there with him. His rational mind clung to the idea of a logical explanation, while his primal instinct told him to run, to leave the station and not look back. The last record began to play, a choice Alex didn't remember making, a song he didn't recognize. But the beat of the music resonated with his own frantic heart, a rhythm synchronized with his growing anxiety. The sense of isolation was now complete, an island in a sea of darkness separating him from all safety. In this place, on this night, Alex had become the fulcrum of a story that had unfolded long before his arrival, and now seemed to demand from him a final role. As the last record played with a sinister creak, Alex's breath became short and labored. Initially, his rational mind dismissed the darkest conjectures. "It's a joke," he told himself, trying to smile at the growing fear. But the reality of the night and the gravity of the hidden messages in the songs had completely eroded that denial like a river carving its bed in rock. A nervous laugh escaped his lips, quickly stifled by the awareness that something or someone was terribly close, perhaps already inside those walls pulsating with ancient secrets. The laugh turned into a lump in his throat as Alex realized the messages were too personal, too precise to be just a joke. He could no longer afford the luxury of disbelief. The realization settled like fog, seeping into the smallest cracks, intangible but omnipresent. The messages were a bridge between the past and the present, and Alex was now walking that bridge, feeling the abyss opening beneath him. With trembling hands, he set aside the vinyls, and his eyes fixed on the microphone, the only thread still connecting him to the outside world. The killer might be here, he confessed to an invisible and silent audience. The realization that this invisible enemy could be so close filled him with a cold terror, but also a fierce determination. He couldn't let fear paralyze him. He had to act. The flickering light of the lamp reflected in his eyes, giving him an almost mad look. He had to trust his instincts, the whispers between the notes, the words hidden in the melodies. The music was no longer a refuge, but a guide through a dark labyrinth. "If you're here," he spoke directly to the possible killer, "I won't let you continue this madness." The words, spoken aloud, echoed in the room, as if challenging anyone hiding in the shadows. The fear that the killer was a step away from him, perhaps behind the door, perhaps in another room, listening to his own broadcast, gripped him. Every tick of the clock, every movement perceived in his peripheral vision made him jump. Yet, Alex clung to that microphone as if it were his lifeline. He knew he couldn't retreat any longer. He had spoken, he had challenged, he had accepted. Now it remained to be seen who would respond to that call, thrown into the night ether. Alex's challenging words dispersed into the air, charged with a new and dangerous energy. He had crossed an invisible boundary. There was no more room for half measures or escape. Reality had taken on the shades of the deepest black, each of his cells permeated by the awareness that he was now an active participant in this macabre game. A pawn moving on the board of a killer who delighted in hiding clues like notes in a deadly symphony. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Alex stood up. Every fiber of his being urged him to run, but he knew he couldn't leave his post. Not yet. He had to face the reality surrounding him, the reality he had ignored for too long, hoping it was just the product of his overexcited imagination. His sense of duty made his fingers fly over the mixer, raising the volume, ensuring his voice could reach anyone listening, seeking comfort in human connection, however illusory it might be. "I'm Alex Voss," he announced, his voice now firm, more out of conviction than certainty. "And this is the last frontier of truth. Perhaps this will be the last message you hear tonight." The decision to face whatever lurked in the studio's shadows brought with it a mix of terror and resolve. The clues had led him here, and it was time to reclaim control of the narrative, to turn the hunt into a confrontation. He couldn't let fear steal his voice, because that voice was his only shield and weapon. The silence between each word was palpable, a void waiting to be filled with answers Alex feared but desperately sought. In that point of no return, he promised himself he would follow this spiral of mystery to its extreme consequences. Each heartbeat, each sigh transmitted through the ether became a final, desperate search for truth. Alex took a deep breath and approached the studio door, his heart in his throat. Every step toward the unknown was an assault against the wall of fear that had imprisoned him. Behind that door lay the possibility of answers or an encounter with something unimaginable. But it didn't matter. Alex was determined to face the night, whatever it brought with it. Alex's heart beat like a war drum in his chest as his hand rested on the cold door handle. The metal seemed to burn at the touch of his sweaty skin. With a burst of courage he didn't know he had, he turned the handle and opened the door, letting the soft studio light spill into the dark corridor beyond. Each step was laborious, each movement an eternity suspended. The corridor, once familiar and reassuring, was now a channel to the unknown. The flickering lights, the shadows stretched like tentacles along the walls covered with old concert posters and past broadcast announcements, turned familiarity into a scene from a horror film. Then he saw it, a silhouette at the end of the corridor, motionless, almost absorbed by the darkness. "Who are you?" Alex's voice was a whisper thick with fear and challenge. No response, only the silence pressing against his ears like the weight of the ocean. He took another step. The silhouette seemed to waver, as if floating, or like an image distorted by water. Alex felt the cold of the air, conditioning mix with the fear snaking down his spine. A flash of light from the end of the corridor revealed the truth. It wasn't a person. It was a mannequin, dressed strangely, with an old man's coat and a 50s fedora, the face hidden in a disturbing shadow. But what paralyzed him was what the mannequin held in its hand. An old radio microphone, identical to the one Alex had used for years. At that point, a recording started, and this time he heard it clearly resonating throughout the station building. The voice was hoarse, that of his predecessor, the man who had occupied his chair before him, the one who had disappeared without a trace. "Despair made me leave too many clues, and I've involved you in something bigger than me and you." The recording cracked through the air. "This isn't a joke, and I've never been far. This station hides more secrets than you can imagine, and some should never be revealed." The shiver that ran down Alex's spine was pure terror. It was the confrontation he hadn't foreseen. Not with a flesh and blood killer, but with the truth of a darkness enveloping everything, a mystery that had swallowed his predecessor and now lured him in with invisible tentacles. A murder that had never been a murder, but a much darker and deeper disappearance. Alex realized that his point of no return had not been confronting the door or the killer, but the moment he had accepted to seek the truth. The radio station had literally swallowed his predecessor. That ancient building had made him disappear forever, without leaving a trace. A single thought now haunted him: that truth could soon swallow him too. The revelation left Alex with a sense of vertigo, as if reality were slipping away under his feet. The voice in the recording continued to weave its dark narrative, each word a condemnation, each silence a forewarning. The radio station, with all its years of music and night voices, was a mask for something far more malevolent, a facade for dark secrets that had claimed more than one life. At that moment of realization, Alex felt a presence behind him. Before he could turn, a cold breath caressed his neck, and a real, close, and shrill voice whispered, "You can't leave it, Alex. Not now that you know." It was no longer his predecessor's voice. It was that of the radio station, or whatever it was. The room flipped, and Alex found himself running. He didn't know if he was fleeing from the presence he felt behind him, or from the reality the station seemed to conceal. He ran through the corridors, each echo of his steps a hammer, driving the truth deeper into his heart. He reached the main door. His trembling blows against the heavy wood a mute prayer for escape. The night outside was a cold blessing, the fresh air washing away the oppression of the internal darkness. Alex was still running, away from the station, away from the vinyl records hiding encrypted messages, away from that truth too terrible to bear. But as the distance between him and the station increased, a new terror gripped him. The reality of his situation began to seep into his mind. No one would believe his story, no one would understand. And the words of his last broadcast haunted him. It was never a murder. What did it mean? The truth would follow him like a shadow, like a melody trapped in a loop in his head. Perhaps there was no escape from such a deep secret. Perhaps the station would continue to broadcast its encrypted messages, waiting for the next curious DJ daring to tune in to a forgotten frequency. Alex's last image was his reflection in a puddle, his face distorted by the water, transformed into a mask of fear. Then the image disappeared. The night stretched silently over the city as the last notes of the broadcast dissolved into the air. And when the dawn light filtered through the dusty windows, it was as if Alex had never existed. The WKRZ station, once pulsing with music and nocturnal chatter, now lay silent. A silent colossus guarding its secrets. The dawn brought a promise of normality, but the quiet was deceptive. No one had seen Alex since that night, and in the weeks that followed, his absence became a whisper among the cafes and empty corridors of the radio station. After all, he was just the night DJ, a dark presence for the majority frequenting the station. Few knew him truly. The records he had played were put away, and their encrypted messages remained unknown, just as the words and phrases he had spoken during his last broadcast were labeled as atmospheric and curiosity-inducing lines for listeners. But, on an apparently calm night, a solitary figure approached the station's console. Trembling fingers touched the keys, and with a click, the broadcast resumed. A familiar voice echoed through the studio walls, deep, calm, but with a note of trepidation. "This is Alex Voss. If you're listening, know that the story isn't over. These signals, these messages, are part of something bigger. The voice paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words or sensing something in the studio's darkness. "I'm not alone," he continued, "and I don't just mean me. There's more here with me, with us. I can't tell you more, not now, but keep listening. Tune in, because..." The voice faded into a static hiss, leaving the broadcast suspended in a pause laden with anticipation.